The pen felt foreign in Marcus's trembling fingers as he slid the stack of legal documents across our marble kitchen counter, his usually confident demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. "Just sign here, Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of forced patience he used when he thought I was being difficult about something I supposedly couldn't understand. "The lawyers have already reviewed everything. It's just a formality to finalize the asset division." What Marcus didn't know, as he watched me flip through pages of what appeared to be routine property settlement paperwork, was that tucked inside my leather portfolio, just 3 feet away, were photocopies of documents bearing my forged signature, documents that would send him to prison for federal fraud and conspiracy charges that carried a maximum sentence of 20 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But let me start from the beginning, because the woman sitting at that kitchen counter was nothing like the naive graduate student who had fallen in love with Marcus Chen 8 years earlier. That woman had believed in partnership, in building something beautiful together, in the kind of love that could weather any storm. She had no idea that the man she was planning to marry would spend the next decade systematically forging her signature on documents that would steal her inheritance, destroy her credit, and ultimately attempt to erase her from the very life they had built together. What Marcus never understood, even as he handed me those final papers with such smug confidence, was that his greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my intelligence. It had been overestimating his own cleverness. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights below into abstract patterns of gold and silver. It was fitting weather for what would become the most important conversation of my marriage, though Marcus remained blissfully unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. The storm outside mirrored the chaos that had been building inside our relationship for months, ever since I had discovered the first irregularities in our financial accounts that had led me down a rabbit hole of deception so deep and complex that I was still uncovering new layers of betrayal. I had always been detail-oriented. It was what made me successful as a forensic accountant, specializing in white-collar crime investigation. My clients were usually corporations trying to recover stolen assets, or law enforcement agencies building cases against sophisticated financial criminals. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same analytical skills I used to expose fraud in multinational companies had ultimately revealed that my own husband was operating an elaborate scheme that made Bernie Madoff look like an amateur shoplifter. Marcus had been forging my signature for years, using my identity to secure loans, establish credit lines, and even purchase properties that I knew nothing about, all while maintaining the facade of the successful software entrepreneur who had simply gotten lucky with a few well-timed investments. The apartment around us told the story Marcus wanted the world to believe about our success. Designer furniture from Italy, original artwork from emerging Pacific Northwest artists, a kitchen that had been featured in Architectural Digest for its innovative use of sustainable material. Everything carefully curated to project the image of a power couple who had built their wealth through Marcus's tech genius, and my supporting role as the beautiful, accomplished wife who provided stability while he pursued his visionary business venture. What our dinner party guests never saw was the foundation of lies that supported this carefully constructed lifestyle, or the systematic identity theft that had been funding our supposed prosperity. I met Marcus during my final semester at the University of Washington, where I was completing my master's degree in forensic accounting while he was wrapping up his MBA with a focus on technology entrepreneurship. The campus coffee shop where we first talked had been crowded with the usual mix of stressed students and overly caffeinated graduate researchers, but Marcus had commanded attention even in that chaotic environment. He possessed the kind of natural charisma that made people want to listen when he spoke, combined with an easy confidence that suggested he knew secrets about success that others were still trying to figure out. Our first conversation had lasted 4 hours, ranging from his plans to revolutionize cloud computing infrastructure, to my fascination with the psychological motivations behind corporate fraud. Marcus had seemed genuinely impressed by my analytical approach to complex financial systems, asking thoughtful questions about the investigative techniques I was learning and expressing admiration for my ability to identify patterns that others missed. You see things differently than most people, he had said that first evening, as we walked across the campus quad under the soft glow of antique street lamps. Most people look at numbers and see data, but you see stories. That's a rare gift. The compliment had felt genuine at the time, like recognition from someone who understood the intellectual satisfaction of solving puzzles that others found overwhelming. Marcus had a way of making me feel like my analytical mind was an asset rather than the obsessive quirk that some previous boyfriends had found intimidating. When he talked about his business ideas, he would ask for my perspective on the financial structuring, seeming to value my insights about risk assessment and market analysis. It felt like the beginning of a true partnership, the kind of relationship where two people's strengths complemented each other to create something greater than either could achieve alone. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of intellectual conversations and shared ambition. Marcus's startup ideas were ambitious, but grounded in real market research, and his ability to articulate complex technical concepts in accessible terms suggested he possessed both vision and practical business sense. We would spend hours in his cramped graduate student apartment, surrounded by whiteboards covered with flowcharts and business models, discussing everything from venture capital funding strategies to the ethical implications of data privacy and emerging technology. Those late-night planning sessions felt like glimpses into a future where we would build something meaningful together. The proposal had come during our graduation weekend, as we stood on the observation deck of the Space Needle, watching the sunset paint Elliott Bay in shades of orange and pink. Marcus had planned everything perfectly, from the private dinner at his favorite restaurant, to the timing that ensured we would have the observation deck nearly to ourselves. "Rebecca," he had said, dropping to one knee with a ring that must have cost more than his entire graduate student's stipend. "You're the only person I've ever met who makes me want to be better than I thought possible. Will you marry me and help me build something extraordinary?" The ring had been stunning, a vintage Art Deco setting with a center diamond that caught the light from every angle, but what had taken my breath away was the sincerity in his voice when he talked about building something together. At 26, I thought I understood what love looked like, but Marcus had shown me a version that combined emotional connection with intellectual partnership and shared ambition. Saying yes had felt like stepping into the life I had always imagined for myself, complete with professional success and personal fulfillment that would grow stronger over time. The early years of our marriage had seemed to validate every optimistic assumption I had made about our partnership. Marcus's first startup, a cloud security platform called SecureStream, had gained traction quickly with early customers who were impressed by his technical innovation and business acumen. My career as a forensic accountant was advancing steadily as well, with a reputation for thoroughness and analytical precision that made me increasingly sought after by law firms and corporate clients dealing with complex financial investigations. We were the kind of couple that other young professionals envied, successful in our respective fields, financially comfortable, and apparently devoted to supporting each other's ambition. We had purchased the penthouse apartment during our third year of marriage, when SecureStream's initial success had generated enough revenue to justify what seemed like a reasonable stretch for our growing income. The mortgage had been substantial, but Marcus's confidence about the company's trajectory and my steady consulting income had made the financial commitment feel manageable. The apartment had represented more than just luxury housing. It was tangible proof that our partnership was generating the kind of success we had dreamed about during those late-night planning sessions in graduate school. But success, I had learned, has a way of revealing character rather than building it. As Marcus's business grew and our social circle expanded to include other entrepreneurs and investors, subtle changes began to emerge in how he talked about our respective contributions to our shared prosperity. The collaborative discussions about business strategy that had characterized our early relationship gradually gave way to Marcus explaining market dynamics to me as if I were a curious observer rather than someone whose analytical training might actually provide valuable insight. The shift had been so gradual that I almost missed it entirely. At dinner parties with other couples from Seattle's tech community, Marcus would introduce me as my wife Rebecca, who keeps me grounded with her practical perspective. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. rather than mentioning my professional expertise in financial analysis. When I would contribute insights about market trends or risk assessment based on my work with corporate clients, Marcus would nod appreciatively and then add clarifying comments that suggested my observations needed his interpretation to be fully understood. "Rebecca has good instincts," he would say with that indulgent smile I was beginning to recognize, though of course the tech sector operates differently than the traditional businesses she usually works with. The professional condescension had been annoying, but it was the financial secrecy that had first triggered my forensic accountant instinct. Marcus had always handled the majority of our household finances, claiming that his business background made him better suited for managing investments and long-term planning. I had been content with this arrangement initially, trusting that someone who had built a successful company would be competent at managing our personal wealth. But as our income had grown, and our financial situation had become more complex, Marcus had become increasingly evasive about specific details of our asset allocation and investment performance. When I had asked to review our portfolio statements during tax preparation season, Marcus had provided summaries rather than the detailed documentation I was accustomed to analyzing in my professional work. "Everything's performing well," he would say when I pressed for more specific information. "The diversification strategy is working exactly as planned, but the details are probably more complex than you'd want to wade through." The dismissive assumption that I wouldn't understand investment strategies that were far simpler than the financial fraud cases I investigated professionally had been both insulting and suspicious. The first concrete evidence that something was seriously wrong had come accidentally, through a clerical error that Marcus couldn't have anticipated. I had been working on a fraud investigation for a client whose identity had been stolen by someone who had used forged documents to establish credit accounts and secure loans. The case had required me to become familiar with the documentation protocols that banks and credit agencies used to verify identity and prevent fraudulent account creation. When I had requested our credit reports to review our financial profile for a potential refinancing opportunity, the information that came back had included accounts and obligations that I had never seen before. There had been a second mortgage on our apartment that I knew nothing about, secured 6 months earlier with what appeared to be my signature on documents I had never seen. A substantial personal loan from a private lending firm, also bearing my signature, that had been used for purposes that weren't reflected in any of our shared financial accounts. Most disturbing of all, there had been evidence of a business partnership agreement that made me a co-owner of investment properties in Vancouver that I had never heard Marcus mention. The signatures on these documents had been skillful forgeries, close enough to my actual handwriting that they might have passed casual inspection, but different enough that my trained eye could identify the subtle inconsistencies that marked them as fraudulent. The formation of letters, the pressure patterns, the subtle variations in spacing that were as distinctive as fingerprints to someone who had spent years analyzing questioned documents in criminal investigation. Marcus had been systematically using my identity to establish financial obligations and acquire assets without my knowledge or consent, operating an identity theft scheme that was far more sophisticated than the cases I typically investigate. The discovery had felt like a physical blow, not just because of the financial implications, but because of what it revealed about the fundamental nature of our relationship. For years, Marcus had been presenting himself as my partner while actually treating me as a resource to be exploited without my knowledge. Every conversation about our shared financial future had been built on lies. Every decision about major purchases or investments had been made without including obligations he had created in my name. The man I had trusted with my heart and my future had been systematically stealing my identity while maintaining the facade of the devoted husband, who simply handled the complex financial details that he assumed I wouldn't understand. But the personal betrayal, devastating as it was, had triggered something else entirely. The same analytical focus that made me successful at exposing corporate fraud. If Marcus had been forging my signature to establish credit obligations and acquire assets, there were likely other aspects of his financial activities that warranted investigation. The methodical, systematic approach I used to uncover corporate embezzlement schemes would be equally effective at revealing the full scope of whatever Marcus had been hiding from me. The investigation I began that weekend had started with the basic due diligence protocols I used in professional cases: comprehensive credit reports, public record searches, and forensic analysis of all available financial documentation. What I had discovered over the following weeks had revealed a pattern of deception so elaborate and systematic that it made the initial forgeries seem like minor infractions in comparison to the larger criminal enterprise Marcus had been operating. The business success that had funded our lifestyle and established Marcus's reputation in Seattle's tech community had been largely fictional. SecureStream's supposed growth and profitability had been maintained through a combination of fraudulent accounting, inflated client contracts, and venture capital funding that had been secured through misrepresentation of the company's actual performance. Marcus had been operating essentially a tech sector Ponzi scheme, using investment capital from new funding rounds to pay obligations from previous investors while maintaining the appearance of sustainable business growth. The forged signatures that had initially alarmed me were just one component of a much larger identity theft operation. Marcus had been using my credentials to establish business credit lines, secure small business loans, and even create shell companies that existed primarily to manipulate his tax obligations and hide assets from potential creditors. My reputation as a forensic accountant had actually made me a more valuable target for identity theft, since my professional standing provided credibility that made fraudulent applications more likely to be approved without extensive verification. Most shocking of all had been the discovery that Marcus had been planning to disappear entirely once his schemes became unsustainable. The Vancouver properties that had been purchased using my forged signature were part of an exit strategy that involved establishing residency in Canada while leaving me responsible for the massive debt obligations he had created in my name, bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, a safety deposit box registered under an alias, and even a second passport obtained through document fraud. Marcus had been preparing to abandon our marriage and our shared life while sticking me with the legal and financial consequences of crimes I knew nothing about. The scope of his deception had been staggering, but what had struck me most profoundly was how completely Marcus had underestimated my ability to uncover his activities. His confident assumption that I wouldn't understand complex financial structures had made him careless about operational security when dealing with someone whose professional expertise was specifically designed to identify and document exactly the kind of fraud he was committing. Every condescending comment about my supposed inability to grasp sophisticated business concepts had been coming from someone whose own financial crimes were so poorly concealed that I could document them using the same techniques I applied to amateur embezzlement cases. The evidence I had compiled over the following months had been comprehensive enough to support both criminal charges and civil recovery actions that would not only expose Marcus's fraud but potentially recover assets that could be used to compensate his victim. But more importantly, the investigation had revealed my own capabilities in ways that Marcus's systematic undermining had obscured. The woman who had been seeking his approval for financial decisions was actually someone with the analytical skills to uncover sophisticated fraud and the professional resources to ensure that justice was served appropriately. As I sat in our designer kitchen that rainy evening, watching Marcus present what he believed were routine divorce settlement documents while remaining completely unaware that I possessed evidence of years of systematic identity theft and fraud, I realized that his greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating my intelligence. It had been overestimating his own cleverness. The man who had spent years treating me like I was too naive to understand complex financial arrangements was about to discover exactly what happened when someone with advanced forensic accounting training decided to audit his criminal enterprise. The divorce papers he was asking me to sign were themselves fraudulent, an attempt to formalize an asset division that would leave me responsible for debts I had never agreed to while allowing Marcus to retain control of properties that had been purchased using my stolen identity. But what Marcus didn't know, as he watched me review the documents with what he assumed was the careful attention of someone trying to understand legal concepts beyond her expertise, was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. The portfolio beside me contained not just photocopies of documents bearing my forged signature, but a complete forensic analysis of Marcus's criminal activities that had been prepared with the same methodical precision I brought to corporate fraud investigations. Bank records, property deed loan applications, tax returns, business registration documents, every piece of evidence necessary to prove systematic identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy charges that would send Marcus to federal prison, while recovering assets that could compensate the investors and creditors he had defrauded. More importantly, I had spent the previous month coordinating with federal investigators who specialized in complex white-collar crime cases. The evidence I had compiled had been reviewed by prosecutors who confirmed that Marcus's activities constituted serious federal crimes with substantial mandatory minimum sentence. The case was strong enough that conviction was virtually certain once charges were filed, but the timing of those charges had been left to my discretion to ensure that Marcus couldn't destroy evidence or flee the country once he realized his exposure. Tonight was the night I had chosen to end the performance I had been maintaining for months, the devoted wife who remained blissfully unaware of her husband's systematic betrayal. Marcus's confidence in presenting fraudulent divorce documents while believing his other crimes remained undetected had provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what kind of woman he had been underestimating for the past 8 years. The rain continued to hammer against our windows as Marcus waited for me to sign the papers that would complete what he believed was his successful escape from the consequences of his criminal activity. What he was about to discover was that the woman sitting across from him possessed capabilities he had never imagined, and had been planning his professional and personal destruction with the same analytical precision he claimed she lacked. The transformation from betrayed wife to strategic adversary was complete. It was time to show Marcus exactly what survival looked like when executed by someone whose strength he had never bothered to understand. The investigation that consumed the following 3 months required a level of methodical precision that went far beyond anything I had encountered in my professional cases. Corporate fraud investigations typically involved analyzing patterns of financial misconduct within established business structure, but documenting Marcus's systematic identity theft meant reconstructing years of criminal activity that had been deliberately concealed through sophisticated operational security measures. Every forged signature, every fraudulent application, every shell company registration had to be verified through independent sources and cross-referenced with financial records that Marcus assumed I would never think to examine. The first breakthrough came when I gained access to our complete banking history through a legal maneuver that Marcus's overconfidence had made possible. During one of his condescending explanations about why I shouldn't worry about the details of our investment portfolio, he had mentioned that all of our accounts were structured to provide me with full access in case of emergency. "You're listed as an authorized user on everything," he had said with that patronizing smile I was learning to recognize as a mask for deception. "I want you to feel secure knowing that you could handle our finances if something ever happened to me." The ironic generosity of giving me access to accounts he was using to commit crimes against me had provided exactly the documentation trail I needed to expose his systematic fraud. Bank statements revealed patterns of fund transfers that corresponded perfectly with the forged loan applications I had discovered, while credit card records showed purchases that supported businesses and properties I had never heard of. Most damaging of all were the electronic deposit records that revealed income from sources that didn't match Marcus's explanations about secure streams, revenue streams, or client base. What emerged from this financial archaeology was a picture of criminal enterprise that was far more sophisticated than I had initially understood. Marcus hadn't just been forging my signature on occasional documents to supplement our household income during temporary business difficulties. He had been operating a systematic identity theft scheme that used my credentials to establish an entirely separate financial ecosystem designed to support criminal activities while insulating him from legal consequences. The shell companies registered in my name had been created with remarkable attention to legal detail, each one established with sufficient documentation and operational history to pass regulatory scrutiny during routine compliance reviews. Northwest Digital Solutions, Pacific Analytics Consulting, Cascade Technology Partners, all of them registered as legitimate businesses with my forged signature on incorporation documents, all of them used to launder money from Marcus's fraudulent activities while creating paper trails that would make me appear to be a willing participant in whatever crimes were eventually discovered. The sophistication of the scheme had been both impressive and terrifying. Marcus had clearly spent considerable time researching the legal frameworks and documentation requirements necessary to commit large-scale financial fraud without detection. The business registrations included appropriate tax identification numbers. The loan applications referenced verifiable employment history and income sources. Even the property purchases had been structured with sufficient legal complexity to avoid triggering automated fraud detection systems that might have revealed the forgery. But what Marcus had failed to anticipate was that his wife possessed exactly the analytical skills and professional resources necessary to uncover sophisticated financial crime. Every technique he had used to conceal his activities from law enforcement and financial institutions was familiar to me from corporate fraud investigations I had conducted for clients dealing with similar schemes. The operational security measures that had protected him from casual discovery were inadequate against someone who understood how white-collar criminals attempted to hide their activities. The discovery process had been emotionally devastating but intellectually fascinating. Each new piece of evidence revealed additional layers of deception while simultaneously demonstrating Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of my capability. His confidence in his ability to manipulate me had made him careless about concealing activities that I could identify and document using standard forensic accounting techniques. The same analytical approach that had made me successful at exposing corporate embezzlement was perfectly suited for unmasking a husband who had been systematically stealing my identity for years. The Vancouver properties represented the most ambitious aspect of Marcus's criminal enterprise and potentially the most legally damaging for both of us. The real estate purchases had been structured as investment opportunities for a legitimate business partnership, complete with detailed financial projections and market analysis that suggested serious long-term planning rather than opportunistic fraud. Property deeds, mortgage applications, tax registrations, even utility account transfers, every aspect of the transactions had been documented with my forged signature on materials that would make me appear to be a knowing participant in an international money laundering operation. The legal implications of this particular scheme had required consultation with attorneys who specialized in cross-border financial crimes since the properties had been purchased using funds that could be traced to fraudulent activities in the United States, while establishing assets in Canada that might be used to avoid prosecution or asset recovery action. If Marcus's crimes were eventually discovered through conventional law enforcement investigation, the Vancouver properties would likely result in charges of international money laundering and conspiracy that could carry sentences far exceeding simple identity theft or domestic fraud. But the international complexity that made the property scheme potentially devastating for me also created opportunities for strategic response that Marcus couldn't have anticipated. Canadian authorities took financial crimes involving forged documents extremely seriously, particularly when those crimes involved attempts to establish residency or assets through fraudulent means. The evidence I had compiled would support not only criminal charges in the United States, but also asset forfeiture actions in Canada that could recover the properties while exposing Marcus's attempts to establish an escape route from American jurisdiction. The systematic analysis of Marcus's financial activities had also revealed the precarious nature of his legitimate business operations in ways that explained his increasing desperation and risk-taking behavior. SecureStream's supposed success had been maintained through increasingly elaborate accounting manipulations that concealed the company's actual financial condition from investors, clients, and even some of his own employees. Revenue recognition had been artificially inflated through contracts that existed primarily on paper, while expenses had been systematically understated by transferring cost to the shell companies he had established using my identity. The venture capital funding that had supported SecureStream's growth and provided the foundation for our affluent lifestyle had been secured through business plans and financial projections that bore little relationship to the company's actual performance or market position. Marcus had essentially been operating a tech sector Ponzi scheme, using investment capital from new funding rounds to meet obligations from previous investors while maintaining the facade of sustainable business growth that justified additional investment. The collapse was inevitable, and the timeline was shorter than Marcus realized. Client contracts that had been artificially inflated to support revenue projections were beginning to expire without renewal, while the company's actual technical capabilities were proving inadequate to deliver the services that had been promised to justify premium pricing. The venture capital firms that had provided Secure Stream's funding were starting to ask detailed questions about operational metrics and market penetration that Marcus couldn't answer without revealing the fundamental deception underlying his business model. Most critically, the forensic analysis revealed that Marcus had been using funds stolen through identity theft to meet Secure Stream's operational obligations and maintain the appearance of financial stability necessary to attract additional investment. The boundary between his legitimate business activities and his criminal enterprises had become so blurred that the collapse of one would inevitably expose the other, creating a cascade of legal and financial consequences that would destroy not only his business but potentially result in criminal charges that could send him to federal prison for decades. The investigation had also uncovered Marcus's relationship with other individuals who appeared to be participating in similar schemes or providing services that facilitated sophisticated financial fraud. Email exchanges and phone records revealed connections to document specialists who could create convincing identification materials, financial advisors who specialized in offshore asset protection, even attorneys who offered services that seemed designed to help clients avoid prosecution for white-collar crime. The network of criminal associates suggested that Marcus's activities were part of a larger ecosystem of financial fraud that extended far beyond individual identity theft or business deception. The sophistication of his schemes and the quality of the forged documents he had been using indicated access to professional criminal services that were far more advanced than what typical white-collar criminals could obtain independently. The implications were both alarming and strategically valuable, since cooperation with federal authorities investigating larger criminal networks could provide significant advantages in negotiating criminal charges and civil remedies. But perhaps the most emotionally challenging aspect of the investigation had been discovering the extent to which Marcus had been planning to abandon our marriage while sticking me with the legal and financial consequences of his criminal activity. The evidence revealed that he had been systematically transferring assets out of our joint accounts while accumulating debt obligations in my name and creating a situation where the eventual collapse of his schemes would leave me responsible for millions of dollars in fraudulent obligations while he disappeared with whatever wealth could be safely hidden offshore. The timing of his exit strategy had been carefully coordinated with the expected collapse of Secure Stream's business model and the likely discovery of his identity theft activity. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands had been established using false identification documents, while the Vancouver properties provided a potential base for establishing Canadian residency that could complicate extradition requests if criminal charges were eventually filed. Even our apartment had been quietly refinanced with additional debt secured by my forged signature, maximizing the amount of money Marcus could extract while ensuring that foreclosure proceedings would target assets registered in my name. The calculated cruelty of planning to destroy my financial future while maintaining the pretense of loving marriage had been almost impossible to process emotionally. Every conversation about our shared dreams and future plans had been occurring while Marcus was actively working to ensure that my future would be consumed by legal battles and financial ruin that he had orchestrated. The man who claimed to love me had been systematically positioning me to serve as the scapegoat for crimes I knew nothing about while he escaped to start a new life with wealth stolen from investors and creditors who trusted his professional reputation. The psychological manipulation had been as sophisticated as the financial fraud. Marcus's pattern of condescending explanations about complex business concepts wasn't just about maintaining control in our relationship. It was about ensuring that I remained ignorant of financial activities that I was supposedly participating in through the forged document. His systematic undermining of my confidence in my analytical abilities served to prevent me from examining our shared finances with the professional skepticism that would have exposed his crimes years earlier. But the same psychological manipulation that had been designed to keep me ignorant and compliant had also provided me with extraordinary motivation for the painstaking investigation required to document his criminal activities comprehensively. Every condescending comment about my supposed inability to understand sophisticated financial structures had been coming from someone whose own crimes were so poorly concealed that I could expose them using basic forensic accounting techniques. The irony of being lectured about financial complexity by someone who was committing amateur-level identity theft had transformed my initial anger into the kind of cold analytical focus that made my professional reputation in corporate fraud investigation. The evidence compilation had required months of systematic work, but it had also provided a kind of therapeutic processing of the emotional trauma associated with discovering that my entire marriage had been built on lies and criminal exploitation. Every forged signature I identified and documented was proof that Marcus had fundamentally misunderstood both my capabilities and my character. Every shell company registration I traced back to fraudulent applications was evidence that his supposed business acumen was actually criminal incompetence disguised by psychological manipulation and sophisticated document fraud. The investigation had also revealed the extent to which Marcus's criminal activities had been funded by legitimate success that I had contributed to achieve. My steady income as a forensic accountant had provided the financial stability that allowed Marcus to take risks with Secure Stream's business development, while my professional reputation had provided credibility that made his fraudulent applications more likely to be approved without extensive verification. The partnership I had believed we were building had actually been a situation where my legitimate achievements were being systematically exploited to enable criminal activities that would ultimately destroy both our reputation. The final phase of evidence gathering had focused on establishing a timeline and methodology that would support criminal prosecution while protecting my own legal interest. The challenge was proving that I had been a victim of identity theft rather than a willing participant in the various schemes that bore my forged signature. The documentation had to demonstrate not only that the signatures were forgeries, but that I had no knowledge of or benefit from the criminal activities they had enabled. This had required careful coordination with federal investigators who specialized in complex white-collar crime cases. The evidence I had compiled was extensive enough to support serious criminal charges, but the presentation had to be structured in a way that clearly established my role as a victim rather than a co-conspirator. The sophistication of Marcus's schemes and the systematic nature of the identity theft created opportunities for criminal prosecution, but they also created risks that overzealous prosecutors might view my apparent participation as evidence of criminal intent rather than victimization. The breakthrough in establishing my legal position had come through cooperation with ongoing federal investigations into the network of criminal associates that Marcus had been working with. Federal authorities had been tracking some of the document forgers and offshore financial advisors for years as part of larger investigations into organized financial crime. My evidence provided crucial documentation of their activities, while my cooperation as a witness offered prosecutors opportunities to build stronger cases against more significant criminal targets. The strategic value of my position had been extraordinary. As someone with professional expertise in forensic accounting and direct access to evidence of sophisticated financial crimes, I could provide testimony and documentation that would be invaluable for federal prosecutors building cases against organized criminal networks. But as a victim of systematic identity theft who had been unknowingly exploited by the same criminals, I was also positioned to seek substantial civil remedies and asset recovery actions that could compensate for the financial and reputational damage Marcus's activities had caused. The cooperation agreement I had negotiated with federal authorities provided comprehensive protection from prosecution while establishing my role as a key witness in cases against Marcus and his criminal associates. The evidence I had compiled would support charges of identity theft, conspiracy, money laundering, securities fraud, and international financial crimes that could result in sentences of 20 years or more for the primary defendant. But more importantly for my personal situation, the cooperation agreement included provisions for asset recovery and restitution that could restore my financial position while ensuring that Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his systematic betrayal. The final element of my legal strategy had focused on timing the revelation of Marcus's crimes to maximize both criminal prosecution and civil recovery, while minimizing my own exposure to potential retaliation or evidence destruction. Marcus's confidence in his deception had made him careless about operational security, but he still possessed the technical skills and criminal connections necessary to destroy evidence or flee the country if he realized that his activities had been discovered and documented. The solution had been to coordinate the revelation with federal authorities, to ensure that Marcus could be arrested immediately upon learning of the charges, while simultaneously filing civil asset recovery actions that would freeze his accounts and prevent him from hiding or transferring wealth that could be used to compensate his victim. The timing had to be precise enough to prevent Marcus from destroying evidence or fleeing, but delayed enough to ensure that all necessary documentation had been compiled and verified. The psychological preparation for confronting Marcus had been almost as challenging as the legal and financial investigation. For months I had been maintaining the facade of the naive wife who remained ignorant of her husband's systematic betrayal while actually conducting the most comprehensive fraud investigation of my career. Every conversation about our future plans had been occurring while I possessed evidence that could send him to federal prison. Every affectionate gesture had been occurring while I planned his complete professional and personal destruction. The performance had required extraordinary emotional control, particularly as Marcus's behavior had become increasingly erratic and controlling in response to the stress of maintaining his various criminal enterprises. His condescending explanations about financial concepts had become more frequent and more insulting, as if he was testing the boundaries of my supposed ignorance while actually revealing his own anxiety about potential discovery. The systematic undermining of my confidence had intensified, suggesting that he was unconsciously aware that his position was becoming more precarious. But maintaining the facade had also provided valuable intelligence about Marcus's psychological state and strategic plan. His increasing desperation had made him more talkative about business challenges and financial pressures, revealing information about the timeline for SecureStream's collapse and his plans for managing the various criminal schemes he was operating. The conversations I was supposed to find boring or incomprehensible had actually provided crucial insights into his vulnerabilities and the optimal timing for exposing his activities. The decision to reveal everything had been triggered by Marcus's presentation of the fraudulent divorce paper, which represented his attempt to formalize the abandonment he had been planning while ensuring that I would remain legally responsible for debts and obligations created through identity theft. The documents had been skillfully crafted to appear legitimate while actually constituting additional criminal charges of document fraud and conspiracy. His confidence in presenting them demonstrated that he believed his deception remained complete and that I posed no threat to his elaborate exit strategy. What Marcus didn't understand, as he watched me review what he assumed were routine legal documents, was that the woman sitting across from him had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. The evidence compilation was complete. The cooperation agreements with federal authorities were finalized and the civil asset recovery actions were ready to be filed simultaneously with criminal charges that would ensure he faced appropriate consequences for years of systematic fraud and identity theft. The rain continued to hammer against our windows as Marcus waited for me to sign the papers that would complete what he believed was his successful escape from the consequences of his criminal activity. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest that was about to engulf his carefully constructed world of deception and exploitation. The woman he had been systematically underestimating for 8 years was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when someone with advanced forensic accounting skills decided to apply those capabilities to exposing the criminal enterprise that had been masquerading as her marriage. The moment had arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes only when months of careful planning converge into a single decisive action. Marcus sat across from me at our marble kitchen counter, his expensive Mont Blanc pen still warm from signing what he believed were legitimate divorce settlement documents, completely unaware that he had just committed his final act of document fraud. The rain against our windows provided a steady percussion that seemed to mark time as I opened my leather portfolio and withdrew the comprehensive evidence file that would transform his confident smile into the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Marcus's expectant expression carried the same patronizing patience he had used throughout our marriage when waiting for me to process information he assumed was beyond my analytical capability. "Just the signature lines, Rebecca," he said, gesturing toward the fraudulent documents with the casual authority of someone who had spent years successfully manipulating legal processes without consequence. The lawyers have structured everything to ensure a clean separation that protects both of our interests going forward. The irony of his concern for protecting my interests while presenting documents designed to saddle me with millions in fraudulent debt obligations was so profound that I almost smiled. I maintained the expression of careful attention that Marcus interpreted as the earnest focus of someone trying to understand complex legal concepts beyond her expertise. The performance I had been maintaining for months was about to end, but these final moments required perfect execution to ensure that Marcus had no opportunity to destroy evidence or flee before federal authorities could take him into custody. I spread the photocopied documents across the counter with the methodical precision I used when presenting evidence to corporate clients, each page positioned to tell the story of systematic criminal enterprise that had been hidden beneath the facade of our marriage. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, loan applications bearing forged signatures, property deeds for Vancouver real estate I had never seen, incorporation documents for shell companies registered in my name without my knowledge, every piece of evidence arranged in chronological order to demonstrate the scope and sophistication of Marcus's identity theft operation. Marcus's reaction progressed through distinct phases that I recognized from corporate fraud investigations when executives were first confronted with evidence of their criminal activity. Initial confusion as his mind struggled to process why I possessed documentation he assumed I would never think to examine. Growing alarm as he began to recognize specific documents and understand the implications of my knowledge. Finally, calculating panic as he realized that his careful operational security had been completely compromised by someone whose analytical capabilities he had systematically underestimated. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone trying to assess the extent of his exposure while maintaining the appearance of calm authority. His eyes moved rapidly across the spread of evidence, identifying documents that revealed not just individual criminal acts, but patterns of systematic fraud that could support serious federal charges. "Some of these look like confidential business materials that you shouldn't have access to." The attempt to reframe my possession of evidence as inappropriate access to his private business records revealed how completely Marcus still misunderstood the situation he was facing. Even confronted with proof that I had uncovered years of systematic identity theft, he was still operating under the assumption that I was the naive spouse who had somehow stumbled across information she wasn't supposed to see, rather than the forensic accountant who had conducted a comprehensive criminal investigation using professional-grade analytical techniques. "I got them the same way I obtain evidence in any fraud investigation," I replied, maintaining the calm professional tone I used when presenting findings to law enforcement agencies. Through systematic analysis of financial records, cross-referencing documentation with independent sources, and forensic examination of questioned documents to identify patterns of criminal activity. The reference to fraud investigation seemed to penetrate Marcus's consciousness in a way that the evidence itself hadn't. For the first time since I had begun revealing the scope of my knowledge, his expression shifted from calculation to genuine alarm as he began to grasp that his wife wasn't just accidentally aware of his criminal activities. She had been professionally investigating them with the same analytical rigor she applied to corporate white-collar crime cases. "Rebecca, I think there may be some misunderstanding here," Marcus said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when trying to explain away inconsistencies in his business dealing. "Some of these documents involve complex financial structures that might look irregular to someone without experience in entrepreneurial finance, but everything has been properly structured according to industry standards." The attempt to gaslight me into believing that systematic identity theft represented normal business practices was so brazen that it actually strengthened my resolve to ensure he faced maximum consequences for his criminal activity. After months of condescending explanations about my supposed inability to understand sophisticated financial concepts, Marcus was now claiming that forged signatures and shell company registration represented legitimate entrepreneurial strategies that I was too inexperienced to recognize as normal. I opened my laptop and pulled up the forensic analysis software I used for professional fraud investigations, displaying side-by-side comparisons of my authentic signature with the forgeries Marcus had used on loan applications and property purchase documents. The analytical methodology was identical to what I used in court testimony when presenting evidence of questioned documents, with statistical measurements and pattern analysis that would be admissible in criminal proceedings. These signature comparisons show systematic variation in letter formation, pressure patterns, and pen movement that are consistent with deliberate forgery rather than natural variation in authentic handwriting. Using the same technical language I employed when testifying as an expert witness in criminal cases, the probability that these signatures were produced by the same individual who created the authentic samples is statistically negligible. Marcus stared at the computer screen displaying forensic analysis that was far more sophisticated than anything he had anticipated. I could produce. The scientific rigor of the presentation made it impossible for him to dismiss my accusations as emotional overreaction or misunderstanding of complex business practices. He was confronting proof that his wife possessed professional expertise specifically designed to expose the type of crimes he had been committing, while assuming she lacked the analytical capabilities to recognize his deception. The incorporation documents for Northwest Digital Solutions, Pacific Analytics Consulting, and Cascade Technology Partners were all filed using forged signatures. I continued, advancing to additional screens that showed the systematic pattern of identity theft across multiple business registrations. These companies were established without my knowledge or consent, using my credentials to create business entities that were subsequently used to launder money from fraudulent activities, while creating documentation that would make me appear to be a willing participant in criminal enterprises. The comprehensive nature of the evidence was clearly overwhelming Marcus's ability to formulate coherent responses or alternative explanations. His confident assumption that he could manipulate the conversation through superior understanding of financial complexity had been demolished by confronting professional-grade forensic analysis that exposed his criminal activities with scientific precision. But the signature forgeries and shell company registrations were only the beginning of what I needed to reveal. The Vancouver properties represented the most serious criminal charges and the clearest evidence of Marcus's intent to abandon me while ensuring I faced the legal consequences of crimes I knew nothing about. The property purchases in Vancouver were structured as an international money laundering operation, I said, pulling up documentation that showed the flow of funds from fraudulent sources in the United States to Canadian real estate investments registered in my name. The money used for these purchases can be traced to identity theft and securities fraud activities, while the ownership structure was designed to establish assets outside United States jurisdiction that could be used to avoid prosecution or asset recovery action. Marcus's face had gone pale as he recognized documents that revealed not just domestic fraud, but international criminal activities that could result in charges carrying mandatory minimum sentences far exceeding simple identity theft. The sophisticated planning required for cross-border money laundering demonstrated criminal intent that would be impossible to explain away as business mistakes or accounting irregularity. The timeline of these transactions corresponds exactly with the expected collapse of Secure Stream's business model and the likely discovery of your domestic fraud activities. I continued, displaying analysis that showed how the property purchases had been timed to provide an escape route from American criminal prosecution. This represents premeditated planning to flee the country while leaving me responsible for debt obligations created through forged documents. The evidence of planned abandonment seemed to affect Marcus more profoundly than the criminal charges themselves. His identity was so thoroughly invested in the fiction of being a successful entrepreneur who had built legitimate wealth through superior business acumen, that confronting proof, his planned escape from the consequences of systematic fraud was psychologically devastating in ways that mere criminal exposure couldn't achieve. But I wasn't finished with the revelations that would demonstrate the full scope of his miscalculation about my capabilities and the comprehensive nature of my response to his betrayal. The coordination with federal authorities represented the strategic masterstroke that would ensure Marcus faced appropriate consequences while protecting my own legal interests and enabling recovery of assets that could compensate his victim. I've been working with federal investigators for the past 3 months, I said, watching Marcus's expression shift from alarm to horror as he realized that his criminal exposure extended far beyond his wife's private knowledge to active cooperation with law enforcement agencies. The evidence I've compiled has been reviewed by prosecutors who specialize in complex white-collar crime cases, and they've confirmed that your activities constitute serious federal crimes with substantial mandatory minimum sentence. The mention of federal prosecutors seemed to drain the last vestiges of color from Marcus's face as the full implications of his situation became clear. This wasn't a domestic dispute about financial irregularities that could be resolved through divorce proceedings and private settlement agreements. He was facing federal criminal prosecution based on evidence compiled by someone with professional expertise in forensic accounting who had been working directly with law enforcement agencies to ensure comprehensive documentation of his criminal activity. The cooperation agreement I've negotiated provides complete protection from prosecution while establishing my role as a key witness in cases against you and your criminal associates. I continue, revealing the extent to which I had positioned myself strategically to maximize both criminal justice and civil recovery outcomes. Federal authorities are particularly interested in the network of document forgers and offshore financial advisors you've been working with as part of ongoing investigations into organized financial crime. The reference to criminal associates revealed another dimension of Marcus's vulnerability that he clearly hadn't anticipated. His assumption that sophisticated operational security would protect him from casual discovery had made him careless about concealing connections to other criminals who were already under federal investigation. My evidence didn't just expose his individual crimes, it provided law enforcement with crucial intelligence about larger criminal networks that could result in additional charges and extended sentences for all participants. The charges being prepared include identity theft, conspiracy, money laundering, securities fraud, and international financial crimes that carry maximum sentences of 20 years or more. I said, displaying federal sentencing guidelines that showed the serious nature of the criminal exposure Marcus was facing. But the cooperation agreements also include provisions for asset recovery and restitution that will restore my financial position while ensuring that your victims receive appropriate compensation. The systematic nature of the legal response I had orchestrated was clearly beyond anything Marcus had anticipated when he began his criminal enterprises. His confidence in his ability to manipulate both legal processes and personal relationships had blinded him to the possibility that his wife possessed not only the analytical capabilities to expose his crimes, but also the strategic thinking necessary to coordinate comprehensive criminal and civil remedies that would ensure justice was served appropriately. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message that provided perfect timing for the final revelation that would complete Marcus's understanding of how thoroughly his situation had deteriorated. The message was from Special Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force, confirming that arrest warrants had been signed and federal agents were positioned to take Marcus into custody as soon as I provided the signal that he had been informed of the charges. Federal agents are waiting outside, I said, showing Marcus the text message that confirmed law enforcement was prepared to arrest him immediately. The timing of your arrest has been coordinated to prevent you from destroying evidence or fleeing the country, while simultaneous civil asset recovery actions will freeze your accounts and recover property that can be used to compensate your victim. The comprehensive nature of the response I had orchestrated was clearly overwhelming Marcus's ability to process the full scope of his exposure. Criminal prosecution, civil asset forfeiture, international cooperation agreement, victim restitution. Every aspect of his situation had been systematically addressed to ensure maximum consequences for his criminal activities, while providing complete protection for my own legal and financial interests. The divorce papers you asked me to sign represent your final criminal act, I continued, returning to the fraudulent documents that had triggered this confrontation. These documents were designed to formalize asset division that would leave me responsible for debt obligations created through identity theft while allowing you to retain control of property purchased with stolen funds. Presenting them constitutes additional charges of document fraud and conspiracy that will be added to your existing federal indictment. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of his miscalculation became clear. The woman he had systematically underestimated for 8 years had only exposed his criminal enterprises with professional-grade forensic analysis, but had also coordinated legal responses that would ensure he faced comprehensive consequences for his systematic betrayal while she emerged with her reputation and financial position restored. The psychological impact of realizing that every assumption he had made about my capabilities and character had been fundamentally wrong was clearly as devastating as the criminal charges themselves. Marcus's entire identity had been built on the fiction that he was the superior partner in our relationship, the successful entrepreneur whose business acumen justified his condescending treatment of someone he viewed as intellectually and professionally inadequate. Confronting evidence that his supposed business success had been criminal fraud while his supposedly naive wife had orchestrated his exposure and prosecution using capabilities he never imagined she possessed was destroying the foundation of his self-concept in ways that mere legal consequences couldn't achieve. He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to understand how the situation had deteriorated so completely without his awareness. If you knew about all of this, why didn't you just confront me? Why involve federal authorities and destroy everything we built together? The question revealed how completely Marcus still misunderstood both the nature of his crimes and the character of the woman he had been systematically exploiting. Even confronted with evidence of years of identity theft and systematic fraud, he was framing the situation as a marital disagreement that could have been resolved through private conversation rather than criminal prosecution of serious federal crime. "We didn't build anything together, Marcus," I replied, my voice carrying the calm authority that came from months of careful analysis and strategic planning. "You built a criminal enterprise that systematically exploited my identity while I unknowingly provided the legitimate success and professional credibility that made your fraud possible. The partnership I thought we had was actually a situation where my achievements were being used to enable crimes against innocent people who trusted your professional reputation." The distinction between legitimate partnership and criminal exploitation seemed to penetrate Marcus's consciousness in a way that the evidence itself hadn't. For the first time since I had begun revealing the scope of my knowledge, his expression shifted from calculation and panic to something approaching genuine comprehension of the moral dimensions of his behavior. The investors who trusted Secure Stream with their money, the financial institutions that approved loans based on forged applications, the regulatory agencies that relied on fraudulent documentation. All of them were victims of systematic deception that you orchestrated while assuming I was too professionally inadequate to recognize or document your criminal activities. I continued. "Justice for those victims requires criminal prosecution and asset recovery, not private marital counseling sessions about communication problems." The systematic undermining of my confidence that had characterized our marriage was suddenly revealed as preparation for criminal exploitation rather than mere psychological manipulation. Marcus's pattern of condescending explanations about complex financial concepts hadn't just been about maintaining control in our relationship. It had been about ensuring that I remained ignorant of criminal activities that I was supposedly participating in through forged documents. "The federal prosecutors I've been working with confirmed that your activities represent some of the most sophisticated identity theft and financial fraud they've encountered," revealing the professional recognition that my investigative work had received from law enforcement experts who specialized in complex white-collar crime. The comprehensiveness of the documentation and the analytical rigor of the forensic analysis have made this case a model for how systematic criminal enterprises can be exposed through professional forensic accounting techniques. The professional validation of my capabilities by federal experts who dealt with sophisticated financial crimes daily was clearly more devastating to Marcus than the criminal charges themselves. His systematic efforts to undermine my confidence in my analytical abilities had been contradicted by recognition from law enforcement professionals who valued competence over compliance and measured success through results rather than gender-based assumptions about intellectual capacity. My laptop chimed with another message from Agent Walsh indicating that federal authorities were prepared to execute the arrest warrants and begin processing Marcus into federal custody. The timing was perfect for completing his education about the comprehensive nature of the consequences he would face for years of systematic criminal behavior. The arrest will be followed by arraignment on federal charges that include identity theft, conspiracy, money laundering, securities fraud, and international financial crimes, I explained, displaying the criminal complaint that detailed each charge with supporting evidence that made conviction virtually certain. The cooperation agreement I've negotiated will provide crucial testimony for prosecuting your criminal associates, while ensuring that recovered assets are used to compensate victims and restore financial damage caused by your systematic fraud. The prospect of facing federal prosecution as part of larger criminal networks was clearly terrifying Marcus in ways that individual charges couldn't achieve. His confident assumption that sophisticated operational security would protect him from serious consequences had been demolished by confronting professional-grade investigation techniques that had exposed not only his individual crimes, but also his connections to organized criminal enterprises. The civil asset recovery actions will freeze all accounts and property connected to your criminal activities, while ensuring that legitimate assets are preserved for victim compensation and restitution. Explaining the comprehensive approach that would address both criminal justice and financial recovery objectives. The Vancouver properties will be subject to international asset forfeiture proceedings that will recover money laundered through cross-border transactions, while eliminating your planned escape route from American jurisdiction. The systematic elimination of every aspect of Marcus's exit strategy was clearly more psychologically devastating than the individual criminal charges. His elaborate planning to avoid consequences while ensuring I faced responsibility for crimes I knew nothing about had been comprehensively defeated by someone whose strategic thinking capabilities he had never bothered to assess accurately. As I gathered the evidence files and prepared to signal federal agents that Marcus had been informed of the charges, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the months since I first discovered evidence of his systematic fraud. The woman who had entered this marriage seeking partnership and validation from someone she believed possessed superior business acumen had been replaced by someone who understood that true strength came from professional competence and moral clarity rather than external approval. The investigation that had exposed Marcus's criminal enterprises had also revealed my own capabilities in ways that his systematic undermining had obscured. The analytical skills that made me successful at corporate fraud investigation were equally effective at exposing domestic criminal activity, while the strategic thinking that guided my professional cases had proved invaluable for coordinating comprehensive legal responses that served both justice and personal protection objectives. Marcus's greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating my intelligence or overestimating his own cleverness. It had been assuming that someone with advanced forensic accounting training would remain indefinitely ignorant of sophisticated financial crimes being committed in her name. His systematic efforts to undermine my confidence had failed to change the objective reality of my professional capability, while his criminal activities had provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what those capabilities could accomplish when applied with complete analytical focus. The final text from Agent Walsh confirmed that federal agents were prepared to take Marcus into custody and begin processing him through the criminal justice system that would ensure appropriate consequences for his systematic betrayal. The coordination with federal authorities had been essential not only for criminal prosecution, but also for protecting my own legal interests and maximizing recovery of assets that could compensate victims of his elaborate fraud scheme. "The federal agents are coming up now," I said, showing Marcus the message that confirmed his imminent arrest. "The cooperation agreement I've negotiated will provide protection from prosecution while ensuring that your criminal activities face comprehensive legal consequences through both criminal and civil proceedings." Marcus stared at me with an expression that combined terror, rage, and something approaching grudging respect as he finally understood the full scope of what the woman he had systematically underestimated had accomplished. The naive spouse who had supposedly needed his guidance to understand complex financial concepts had orchestrated his complete professional and personal destruction, while positioning herself for career advancement and financial recovery that would exceed anything they had achieved together through legitimate means. The sound of footsteps in our apartment hallway marked the end of Marcus's criminal career and the beginning of a new chapter in my life that would be built on professional competence and personal integrity rather than psychological manipulation and systematic exploitation. The woman who had believed in partnership and mutual support had been replaced by someone who understood that true success required independence, strategic thinking, and the courage to demand justice when confronted with systematic betrayal. Federal agents entered our apartment with the calm professionalism that characterized well-executed white-collar crime arrests. Agent Walsh introduced herself and her colleagues while presenting arrest warrants that detailed the federal charges Marcus would face based on evidence I had compiled through months of systematic investigation. The process was handled with dignity and efficiency that reflected the serious nature of the crimes while maintaining appropriate procedural protections for all involved parties. Marcus was taken into federal custody without resistance, his confident facade finally replaced by the blank expression of someone whose entire world had collapsed in the space of a single conversation. As federal agents led him away from the apartment that had served as the headquarters for his criminal enterprises, I felt a profound sense of closure that combined personal vindication with professional satisfaction at seeing justice served appropriately for systematic crimes against innocent victims. The months that followed Marcus's arrest confirmed that the strategic approach I had developed for responding to his betrayal had achieved every objective I had established during the planning phase. The criminal prosecution proceeded exactly as federal authorities had predicted, with Marcus ultimately pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for cooperation agreements that helped prosecutors build cases against the criminal networks he had been working with. The federal sentence of 15 years reflected both the serious nature of his crimes and the value of his cooperation in exposing larger criminal enterprises. More importantly, the criminal conviction made civil asset recovery actions straightforward, with courts ordering comprehensive restitution that restored my financial position while providing compensation for investors and creditors who had been defrauded through his systematic scheme. The professional recognition I received for the quality of my forensic investigation and cooperation with federal authorities led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies that specialized in complex, white-collar crime cases. The analytical techniques I had developed for exposing Marcus's criminal enterprises proved valuable for other cases involving sophisticated financial fraud. While my testimony in related prosecutions established my reputation as an expert witness whose professional capabilities were recognized by federal court, 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I stood in the corner office of my new consulting firm, specializing in forensic accounting and white-collar crime investigation. The view overlooked Elliott Bay and the Seattle skyline that had provided the backdrop for both my marriage and its systematic betrayal, but the perspective was entirely different now. Where I had once seen a landscape of personal limitation and professional dependence, I now saw opportunities for building success that was based on demonstrated competence rather than external validation. The transformation from betrayed wife to recognized expert in financial crime investigation had required confronting the most sophisticated criminal enterprise I had ever encountered. But it had also provided the foundation for professional advancement that exceeded anything I could have achieved through the partnership I had believed Marcus and I were building. The systematic undermining of my confidence that had characterized our marriage had failed to change the objective reality of my analytical capability. While his criminal activities had provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what those capabilities could accomplish when applied with complete focus and professional rigor, the woman who had sought Marcus's approval for financial decisions had been replaced by someone whose expertise was sought by federal authorities, corporate clients, and legal professionals who valued competence over compliance and measured success through results rather than gender-based assumptions about intellectual capacity. The validation I had once sought from condescending praise was now provided by professional achievements that reflected genuine competence in challenging analytical work. As I reviewed case files for new clients seeking assistance with complex fraud investigations, I reflected on the journey from humiliated spouse to recognized expert that had begun with discovering Marcus's systematic identity theft. The man who had told me I would never understand sophisticated financial concepts was serving the third year of his federal sentence, while I was building a consulting practice that specialized in exposing the exact type of crimes he had committed with such competence in his superior cleverness. His systematic underestimation of my capabilities had provided the perfect cover for acquiring the evidence and developing the strategic responses necessary to ensure comprehensive justice for his criminal activity. The woman he had dismissed as professionally inadequate had demonstrated analytical skills that exceeded those of the federal investigators who specialized in complex white-collar crime, while coordinating legal responses that achieved both criminal prosecution and civil recovery objectives that protected victims and ensured appropriate consequences for systematic fraud. The coffee cup that had held my final morning beverage in our shared apartment had been replaced by the satisfaction of building professional success that was entirely independent of external validation or psychological manipulation. The transformation was complete. I hadn't just survived Marcus's betrayal, I had used it as the foundation for demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything he had ever imagined, while ensuring that justice was served for crimes against innocent people who had trusted his professional reputation. Some justice, I had learned, wasn't about destruction or revenge, it was about transformation, professional vindication, and the systematic application of analytical capabilities to ensure that criminal behavior faced appropriate consequences, while victims received comprehensive compensation for systematic fraud and betrayal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.